Look with me at Genesis 24. Abraham wanted to find a wife for Isaac, not among the Canaanites who were destined to be expelled from the land. That would be a very great problem for them in inheriting the land. But he wanted to find a wife for Isaac among his own family. And so he took his servant, the oldest one, the one that he'd put in charge of everything. So evidently, the servant he had the greatest confidence in to do this really daunting task, to find a wife for his son. He makes him take an oath that he will go back there and he will find her and he will bring her back. Now, you would think that would be kind of a difficult task. You're bringing a woman back to marry someone she's never met, never seen. They didn't have texting and email back then. She'll probably never communicate with her family again. She's going to have to be sort of a female Abraham, I suppose, willing to leave family and homeland to go to some unseen place to meet some unseen husband. And the servant wants to know, well, what if she won't go back? Can we salvage the situation by bringing Isaac back there to meet her? And he said, no. Under no circumstances do you do that. God will send his angel and arrange this, but if he should not, you're released from that oath. So the emphasis is on you do what I tell you, not whether you're successful or not in getting her to agree to come back. That is just a very difficult job, a very great responsibility that God gives to his servant. In verse 10, then the servant took, we're in Genesis 24:10, the servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master and set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. He said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now make it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink and I will water your camels also, may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master. I appreciate what this servant does. In this very difficult task, he turns to God. He asks God to lead him to the right woman. In fact, he designs sort of a character test. He says, now, may the right woman be the one. I ask her for a drink, and she gives me a drink and offers to water my 10 thirsty camels too. I've never had a camel, but I understand they can drink a lot. Offering to water 10 camels was no small task, and probably not something that would typically be offered to some unknown guy who asks you for a drink. But that's a very logical requirement. Back in Genesis chapter 18, we see about Abraham when 3 strangers came by his house. And he was hospitable in an incredible way. They turned out to be angels, but I take it he didn't know that at first. And he tells them, can you wait here a minute and I'll get some bread and water for you. And he rushes here and he runs there and he dashes over there and he gets a sumptuous feast prepared for those men. It was just an amazing act of hospitality. And then he stands beside them as they eat, ready to answer any other needs they might have. So if you want to find a wife for Abraham's son, it's appropriate that she be a servant, that she be a hospitable person, that she be someone who's willing to put herself out to take care of someone she doesn't even know. That would be a kind of a logical test, it seems to me, for a person in this situation. So, verse 15, before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin, and no man had had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please let me drink a little water from your jar. She said, drink, my lord, and she quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. Now when she'd finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. There are some impressive things in this story. He's not even finished the prayer yet. He looks up. She's right there. He asks her for a drink. She gives him a drink. She says, let me bring water for your 10 camels as well. And did you notice how she runs to the well to be drawing the water for the camels? Reminds you a lot of Abraham back in Genesis chapter 18. She's a whir of activity. It's a very hopeful sign. She's really exceeding the servant's hopes and expectations and prayers. But you remember there's one more big question. We don't know for sure if she's the right one yet. She needs to be one of Abraham's relatives, and he doesn't know whether she is yet or not. Will she really be the one or not? Verse 22, when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrists weighing 10 shekels in gold and said, whose daughter are you? That's a big question. Please tell me, is there room for us to lodge in your father's house? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. You may not know what that means. But if you've been reading carefully in Genesis up to this point, this is unbelievable. She is Bethuel's daughter. Bethuel was Milcah's son. Do you realize who Milcah was? Milcah was the daughter of Abraham's brother Haran, Abraham's brother Haran, and the wife of his other brother Nahor. Bethuel is related to both of Abraham's brothers, the grandson of one, the son of the other, and she is his daughter. You couldn't get a closer relative if you tried. She is perfect for this. It's amazing how God, when he answers prayers, exceeds all possible expectations. And I want you to notice what this servant does. Verse 26, the man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. He did it right there on the spot. He said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my brothers. Then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. I appreciate the fact that as soon as this servant recognizes the Lord's blessing, right then and there, he prostrates himself and he prays and he thanks and praises God for answering his prayer. That is a good sign. One of the things that I think is one of the most forgotten virtues in the Bible is gratitude. We need to be thanking God. But to thank God, we've got to be recognizing God. We've got to be praying and asking for specific things and then seeing God gave that to me, and thank him immediately and fervently and frequently for the blessings that he gives us. This servant has a very admirable awareness of God. He has a good God consciousness in what he does. He sees the hand of God. He prays before he acted. He praises God when his prayers are answered. He recognizes that the things that happen are in the hand of God. And he doesn't mind who sees him praise God either. He drops down right then and thanks God and praises him. Now there's really one more big question, and that is, will she go back with him? Now look at verse 29. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring when he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists. And when he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, saying, "This is what the man said to me," he went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, "Come in, blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside, since I have prepared the house and a place for the camels?" Now, we know Laban from later on in the story. Laban, Rebekah's brother, and he's acting perfectly in the character we know him to have later. When he sees the jewelry that this servant has brought, he runs to the servant and invites him in. He's done some quick housekeeping. Everything's ready for him and the camels. And Laban is a man greatly motivated by riches, as we see throughout the rest of the book of Genesis. So here's the servant. He's come a long ways to fulfill this responsibility. And things are going well. Verse 33, but when food was set before him to eat, he said, "I will not eat until I've told of my business." You appreciate that about this servant too. He's got a great deal of devotion to duty. And he may be hungry. I would think he surely was by this point, but he's not going to eat until he finds out if she's going to come, until he states his business, until he discharges the responsibility that Abraham had given him. And so he said, "I am Abraham's servant," verse 34, "the Lord has greatly blessed my master, so that he has become rich, and he has given him flocks and herds, and silver and gold, and servants and maids, and camels and donkeys." As he itemizes Abraham's assets, he makes it clear the Lord has given him those things. The thing that impresses me the most about this servant, he sees the hand of God at every step. In verse 36, "Now Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master in her old age, and he has given him all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, 'You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house and to my relatives and take a wife for my son.' I said to my master, 'Suppose the woman does not follow me.' He said to me, 'The Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you to make your journey successful, and you will take a wife for my son from my relatives and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my relatives, and if they do not give her to you, you will be free from my oath.' So I came today to the spring and said, 'O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you will make my journey on which I go successful, behold, I'm standing by the spring, and may it be that the maiden who comes out to draw, and to whom I say, please let me drink a little water from your jar, and she will say to me, you drink and I will draw for your camels also, let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son.' Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder and went down to the spring and drew, and I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, drink and I will water your camels also. So I drank, and she watered the camels also. Then I asked her and said, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. And I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her wrists. And I bowed low and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had guided me in the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for my son. And so now, if you are going to deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me. And if not, let me know that I may turn to the right hand or the left. Again, you see, as he tells the story to Rebekah's brother and father, he is quick to acknowledge the Lord's hand in all of this. Very impressive, very encouraging attitude on the part of this servant. But the question is, will they let her go back? Will she go back? Verse 50, then Laban and Bethuel replied, the matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. When Abraham's servant heard their words, you know what he's going to do now, don't you? He bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. Every time God blesses him, he bows himself before God and thanks and praises him. He is so aware that every detail of this trip is in God's hand, and he gives God the glory and the credit. They're going to let her go. Now, this is quite a shock. Can you imagine? You're going along smoothly in your own little world when this guy pops into your life one day and says, I'm going to take your sister, your daughter, and take her back home for a wife to my master's son. And the next day he says, let's go. You know, that's kind of abrupt. You know, we weren't really exactly planning on such a quick trip. Well, that's what happens. And they say, verse 55, let the girl stay with us a few days, say 10. Afterwards she may go, it sounds reasonable to me, at least a 10-day transition period. He said to them, do not delay me. Since the Lord has prospered my way, send me away that I may go to my master. He doesn't want to delay not even 10 days. God's purpose takes precedence over the desires of the family. So they say in 57, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. So she does. Right then and there, Rebekah makes this momentous decision against her family's wishes. She steps out on faith as Abraham had done, and she just goes with this servant back to this unknown territory to meet this unknown man that she will marry upon her first encounter with him. This is one of those cases, I guess, where love followed the marriage. They didn't know each other before they got married. Not necessarily recommending we try that approach today, but it is rather remarkable that two faithful Christians could grow to love each other by their determination if they met and married. And so they do. But the thing that I really want to stress in this story, and the thing that impresses me so much, is the character of this servant to see the hand of God in everything that happens. Now, I believe that's something we need. I want to give kind of a however to start with, and then I want to make my point. Is there a possibility that we could improperly blame God for something he didn't do? And the answer is yes, that does happen sometimes. Look with me at 1 Samuel for a minute. In 1 Samuel chapter 23, David, during the time Saul is persecuting him, has gone and rescued the Israelite city of Keilah from the hand of the Philistines. And that means David and his men are inside the walled city of Keilah. 1 Samuel 23:7. When it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars. Saul said, God is giving David into my hand. Wrong. God warned David to get out of there before Saul ever came. Saul was saying God was doing something that God was not doing in this situation. Next chapter, 1 Samuel 24:4. David and his men are in a cave. Interestingly, Saul comes into the first part of that cave to take care of some personal needs, and he doesn't see David and his men back deeper in the cave, but of course they see him in the light of the mouth of the cave. And David's men say, 1 Samuel 24:4, behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I'm about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as seems good to you. They say this is God wanting you to kill Saul. No, not true. Wrong read on the circumstances, and David realizes that, and he doesn't do that. It is possible to claim that God is doing something that God's not doing. God wasn't giving Saul to David to kill right then. 2 chapters later, 1 Samuel 26:8, then Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Remember, they were in the camp right beside Saul when God had caused them to fall into a deep sleep, and Abishai saying, let me kill him. This is God giving you vengeance on Saul. And David again said no. So I understand there are times when people can blame God for something that God's not up to. That said, there is an awfully lot of emphasis in the Bible on the need to see God's hand, to pray to God, and to give God the glory and the credit for the things he is doing. I think we are a lot more likely to just not recognize the Lord than we are to say God's doing something he didn't do. Look at Acts 14. I want to look at a few examples in the New Testament. Acts 14:27, Barnabas and Saul left Antioch, went on an extensive preaching journey. They preached the gospel to thousands of people, converted, hard telling how many, started churches in a bunch of different places. And they got back to Antioch. Acts 14:27, when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. You know, I would have reported all the things I'd done, the places I'd gone, the people I'd preached to, the churches I'd started. Paul doesn't do that. He reports on what God had done. Look at Acts 15, verse 4. When they arrived at Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. Look at Acts chapter 21, verse 19. After he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. We have this tendency to talk about the things we do, and if people glorify anybody, they glorify us. Paul always talked about what God did, and people were led to glorify God by that. Look at the book of 2 Corinthians. There are so many times in 2 Corinthians, which is probably the most open of the books Paul wrote, where Paul gives God the credit. In 2 Corinthians 1, he talks about how he had terrible affliction in Asia. Verse 9, indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death. I assume this was persecution, but whatever it was, when he came out of it, he recognized that God was the one who delivered him. He saw the hand of God in that. In chapter 3, verse 4, such confidence we have through Christ toward God, not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant. Paul said, I don't consider that anything I do that's good comes from me. God is the one who equips me and makes me adequate. In chapter 3, verse 18, but we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed in the same image from glory to glory. God is the one who's transforming us. And he gives God the credit for that. Look at chapter 7, verse 6. In 2 Corinthians, Paul was really worried about how the Corinthians had received a painful letter he'd written and Titus's visit. And he was so worried about that, he couldn't even take advantage of an opportunity to evangelize in Troas. He went on to Macedonia hunting for Titus. When he found Titus, look at chapter 7, verse 6. But God, who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus. He didn't say Titus comforted us. He said God comforted us by the coming of Titus. Chapter 8, verse 16. But thanks be to God who puts the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. Titus has a great attitude toward the Corinthians. God put it in his heart to have that. Chapter 9 and verse 8. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. Our material prosperity. It's God that is giving us the abundance to be able to share with others. And one more passage. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Paul was also really worried about the Thessalonians, especially with them being new converts and expecting a lot of persecution. He decided to remain alone at Athens and send Timothy. Timothy came back and told him good news. The Thessalonians are doing really well. He says in verse 9, for what thanks can we render to God for you in return for all the joy with which we rejoice before our God on your account. And then he prays to God for them, as he does for so many. What I see in Paul, what I see in the Bible among servants of God, is they were constantly praying to God and constantly seeing the hand of God and constantly giving thanks and praise to God for the wonderful things that he did. It's a tremendous pattern for us. We need to be like the servant of Abraham, always praying, always seeing God's hand, and always giving to him the credit, the thanks, and the praise that he deserves. Sometimes we're tempted to let people who believe false doctrines almost move us off of that ground. We can't do that. We need to constantly be aware of the Lord and constantly be in communion with him and giving him the credit and the praise. You need to come to the Lord this morning if you're not a Christian. Not for some personal glory, but because God wants you to. God gave his son. God wants to save you. All we can do is encourage you. We can baptize you, but we don't provide the salvation. God has done that through Jesus Christ. There's a lot of reasons to obey the gospel. Obviously, we want to be saved. We want to be forgiven. And we want to have an eternal hope. But more than that, we want to glorify the Lord. He did all of what he did in sending his son. Jesus did all of what he did in sacrificing himself. After all of that, he deserves our response in obedience and faith to come to him. If you have not done that, we encourage you to do so. Will we stand and sing?